Working at a movie theater seemed like an easy job: free popcorn, quiet shifts, and endless reruns of blockbuster hits. But everything changed when the reels for the forgotten frames arrived. The audience vanished halfway through the showing, leaving behind only their shoes. Now, every shift feels like a countdown to a horror I can't escape, and I'm terrified that one day I'll be the one who doesn't make it out. The popcorn machine let out a hiss, its buttery aroma mixing with the stale scent of carpet that had soaked up decades of spilled soda. I was behind the counter, half watching the old, promotional loop on the lobby TV. Just another Tuesday night. The theater was practically deserted, one family lingering over a matinee, a couple on their first awkward date in the back row of screen 5. It was the kind of quiet I'd grown used to. "Hey, could you check projector 3?" My manager, Carl, grunted from his office. He didn't even look up from his crossword. "Customers keep saying it flickers weird." Weird was right. Screen 3 had always been a problem. Bulbs burnt out faster there, soundtracks distorted into static at odd moments. I'd chalked it up to outdated equipment, but lately the projector had been acting up even during routine maintenance, shutting off mid-reel or playing faint, garbled whispers when the theater was empty. I trudged up the narrow staircase to the projection booth, where the hum of old machinery filled the stale air. The booth window overlooked the darkened theater below, its rows of empty seats illuminated by the faint glow of the paused screen. The projector's reels spun lazily, though the film had stopped playing. Leaning closer, I froze. I could swear something moved in the reflection of the glass not behind me, but within the room's dark, empty seats. A tap on my shoulder made me jump. I turned, heart racing, to find no one there, just the steady hum of the machine and the faint sound of static from the projector. I bolted back downstairs. Carl didn't even glance up. "Fix it." I muttered something affirmative. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the theater had been watching me. Next morning, a shipment was waiting outside the back door. Unmarked, sealed with thick, industrial tape, it didn't match the usual delivery schedule. Carl shrugged, dragging the box inside with a grunt. "Probably some weird indie film. Just catalog it." Inside, there was only one reel. Its canister was rusted, the title etched into the metal in uneven, jagged lettering: The Forgotten Frames. No director. No studio. Nothing. The film stock felt wrong under my fingers, too cold, too brittle. The frames shimmered strangely when I held them to the light, as though they didn't belong in this world. Still, Carl didn't hesitate to slot it into the schedule. Late night screening. Nobody's gonna show up anyway. That night, I stood alone in the projection booth, threading the fragile film into the machine. It resisted, snagging against the rollers like it didn't want to be played. Finally, I got it running and stepped back to watch the first few seconds. The screen flickered to life. At first, it showed nothing but gray static. Then, a scene materialized: a desolate field, dry and lifeless under a colorless sky. The camera panned slowly, shakily, as if the person filming didn't want to see what lay ahead. A shadow flickered at the edge of the frame, something long-limbed and shifting. And then the screen cut to black. I leaned in closer, heart pounding. The reel kept spinning, but the film seemed to vanish, as though it was eating itself frame by frame. "Ready to start?" a voice behind me asked, and I nearly screamed. Carl was there, impatient. "People are waiting." I glanced at the empty booth. No one had shown up, or so I thought. By the time the movie began, 6 people had gathered in screen 3, 3 teenagers sneaking popcorn, a couple whispering in the back row, and a lone man in a trench coat who hadn't said a word since entering. The lights dimmed, and I stood in the doorway, half watching the screen. The opening shot played again: the field, the sky, the trembling camera. This time, the scene stretched on longer. Faint whispers curled through the speakers, growing louder, though no one spoke in the film. A figure emerged in the distance, a flickering silhouette that didn't walk so much as glide. "Ice." The whispers grew into a distorted chant. The audience shifted uncomfortably, some leaning forward, others shrinking back. I felt a strange weight in the room, as if the air itself pressed against my chest. Then the screen blinked. For a moment, it showed nothing but black. When the image returned, the camera was closer, too close. The shadow figure was now inches from the lens, a face, forming in its swirling darkness. I couldn't make out the features, but its eyes glowed faintly, unblinking. I glanced at the audience, expecting discomfort. Instead, they were frozen, rigid. Not one of them moved, not even to breathe. The screen glitched again, and the lights flickered. The whispers stopped. Silence. When the film ended, the house lights came up. My stomach dropped. Every seat was empty. But their belongings remained: jackets, shoes, a spilled bag of popcorn. No one had left. They were just gone. The next morning, Carl waved me into his office before I could even clock in. His usual bored expression was gone, replaced by something harder, colder. "Whatever happened last night?" "We're not talking about it," he said, his voice low. "Probably some prank. Don't need this blowing up online." I wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't a prank. But the words died in my throat when I saw the theater seating chart pinned to his desk. 6 highlighted seats empty. No record of tickets sold. Later, I slipped back into the projection booth, determined to find answers. The reel for the forgotten frames sat on the desk, the rusted canister now warped and pitted with tiny holes, like something had corroded it overnight. As I lifted the lid, something sharp pricked my finger. Blood welled, staining the brittle film. Inside, I found a slip of yellowed paper. It wasn't part of the film. The handwriting was jagged and desperate. "Don't play it again. Don't let them see you." My stomach clenched. I turned the note over. On the back was a series of names. The last one was dated 3 months ago, scrawled over with the word "gone." When I replayed the reel later that night, the projector hissed and sputtered, spitting static. The same desolate field flickered on screen, but this time the whispers were louder, almost discernible. My name. They were saying my name. The lights in the booth dimmed, and I froze as the projector bulb flared unnaturally bright, throwing a distorted shadow against the wall. The shape wasn't mine. It was taller, elongated, with twisted limbs that twitched in unnatural ways. I yanked the power cord. The machine stopped, but the whispers didn't. By the end of the week, 3 employees had quit. Beth, who ran the concession stand, claimed she saw someone in the lobby mirror behind her, a face, grinning and too wide. Mitch left. Without notice, his locker empty, the word "watching" scrawled inside in permanent marker. That night I was alone. Carl had disappeared after muttering something about meeting a distributor. The theater was dead silent. Then came the last screening. The Forgotten Frames was scheduled again, though I hadn't seen anyone buy tickets. I prayed no one would show, but as the start time approached, I heard the faint creak of seats in screen 3. My chest tightened. I hadn't let anyone in. The projector powered on by itself. Light flooded the booth, and I rushed to stop it, but the control panel wouldn't respond. On the screen, the field appeared again, but this time the camera wasn't moving. The shadowy figure stood directly in the center, unmoving, staring at something. No, someone just out of frame. I turned to the theater window. The seats weren't empty. Shadows filled them, faint, humanoid, shapes swaying slightly, almost in rhythm with the whispers emanating from the screen. My breath caught as I realized they were all facing me. The air grew icy, my breath visible in the dim booth. The projector flickered, and one by one, the shadowy figures turned their heads, jerking unnaturally, until they faced the screen. I heard my name again, louder this time, echoed by dozens of distorted voices. The last thing I saw before bolting was my own reflection in the glass, only it wasn't me. My Reflection smiled. I couldn't go back, but the theater wouldn't let me leave. The whispers followed me home, curling through static on my TV, crackling through my phone. At night, I saw flashes of that barren field in my dreams. The camera's jerky movements now my own. I felt the weight of someone or something watching. I began digging. News articles, old film records. I found the name of the director Elias Greaves. His work was infamous in underground circles, described as transcendental horror. No one knew what had happened to him. His final film, The Forgotten Frames, had debuted once in a small European festival. Every attendee disappeared. The film was confiscated, but rumors spread of it resurfacing in random locations, always claiming new victims. The more I searched, the darker it became. A pattern emerged: small theaters like ours, a single reel arriving with no explanation, and employees who vanished one by one. I found another note buried in a forum, written by someone claiming to have survived a screening. Read the movie isn't a movie. It's a doorway. And once you see them, they see you. I burned the reel that night, or at least I tried. The flames wouldn't catch. The brittle film hissed, releasing a sickly, charred smell, but it remained intact, untouched by the fire. When I returned to the theater the next day, The Forgotten Frames was already queued up, the projector spinning on its own. The shadows in the seats turned toward me, and this time they didn't stop smiling. The projector roared to life before I touched it, the ancient machine rattling like it might collapse. My hands trembled as I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't even load the reel. Yet there it was, spinning like it had a will of its own. The Forgotten Frame started playing on the screen below, its eerie opening the barren field. The choking gray sky already burned into my memory. My reflection stared at me in them. Projection booth window, distorted and grinning. I couldn't stop myself. Something pulled me forward, closer to the screen. The lights in the theater dimmed, plunging the room into darkness. My legs moved on their own, carrying me down the narrow stairs toward the seats, each step heavier than the last. I couldn't hear my breath, couldn't hear my heart. Only the whispers. When I entered screen 3, the audience was full. But it wasn't people sitting there, it was them. The shadows I'd seen before now had form. They turned as one, faces blank but for faint, glowing eyes. My name echoed through their whispers, each voice layered and wrong. The movie shifted. It wasn't the field anymore. It was me. A shaky, nauseating shot of me in the booth, wide-eyed, pale, staring into the lens like I'd been caught in a nightmare. The camera moved closer, my face filling the frame, lips curling into a smile I didn't feel. I couldn't look away. The shadows rose, moving toward me in slow, deliberate steps. When I screamed, they didn't stop. They walked into the screen. No, they walked through it. The field engulfed me. The air was heavy, dry, and suffocating. I spun around and saw him, the filmmaker, Elias Greaves. His eyes were pits of endless black. "Welcome," he rasped. "You're part of the story now." The screen blinks off, leaving the theater silent. My reflection was gone. I never left that room. The field stretched endlessly around me, the brittle grass crunching underfoot as I stumbled forward. The sky was wrong, too low, too heavy, a gray void pressing down on my skin. I turned, in circles, desperate for a landmark, a way out. But the only thing in sight was him. Elias Greaves stood motionless, his face pale and stretched like a mask pulled too tight. His voice came not from his mouth, but from the ground, the sky, the very air. The story doesn't end. Not here. Not ever. The ground beneath me began to tremble. Cracks spidered through the dirt, dark and deep, whispering my name in a chorus of distorted voices. Shapes crawled out of the fissures, shadowy things, all arms and teeth and empty eyes. They moved unnaturally, jerking, closer with each heartbeat. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the thick, suffocating air. I don't know how I made it back. One moment, I was in that endless field, the next I was gasping for breath on the sticky carpet of screen 3. The theater was empty, no shadows, no whispers, just silence. But the screen still glowed faintly. As I stared, the static shifted, forming an image. Me, standing alone in the empty theater. Behind me, the shadows began to crawl out from the seats. I turned, but the room was still empty. The screen blinked back to static. I ran. I left the theater, the cursed screen behind. But even as I reached the safety of the street, I couldn't escape the whispers. They followed me home, curling out of the static on my TV, the hum of my fridge, the dead air on my phone. Weeks later, I walked past another theater. My heart stopped when I saw the marquee, now showing the forgotten frames. I froze, but the people walking by didn't seem to notice. They lined up, laughing, chatting, unaware of what waited inside. I wanted to scream, to warn them, but no sound came out. The glass door swung open. For a moment I saw my reflection, but it wasn't mine. It grinned at me, a sharp, knowing smile, and then it whispered, "Your turn. If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings it closer to reality. Are you certain the screen in front of you is just a screen? Or is it watching you back?" The casket was open, my face pale and lifeless, framed by the flowers I used to hate. The room was filled with soft whispers and muffled sobs as people shuffled past, their eyes red and swollen. I stood in the back of the room, my hands trembling, screaming for anyone to notice me. But no one turned, no one even flinched, as if I were nothing more than a shadow. It was then I realized the truth: I wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The church doors creaked as I pushed them open, the faint scent of lilies and candle wax wafting out. My first thought was how strange it was to see so many familiar faces gathered. My second thought was that I didn't remember being invited. The room was eerily quiet except for soft sniffles, the weight of grief pressing on the air like a heavy fog. I stepped forward, curiosity pricking my skin. That's when I saw it, the photo on the easel by the altar. My photo. It was a candid shot, one I barely remembered being taken, but there it was, framed by flowers and staring back at me like a ghost. My stomach dropped as I stumbled closer. The whispers faded to a muffled hum as I took in the scene: the polished wood of the casket, the soft folds of the satin lining, the unmoving figure inside. My own face stared back at me, pale and peaceful. I stepped back, my breath quickening. This couldn't be real. My legs felt like lead as I turned to the crowd, searching for anyone who could explain what was happening. But no one looked at me. Their eyes were fixed on the casket, on me. I reached out to tap my friend, Sarah, on the shoulder, but my hand passed through her as if she wasn't there, or as if I wasn't. A chill ran through me as I stepped back, the reality crashing down. I was at my own funeral, and no one knew I was there. "Sarah," I shouted, my voice trembling. "It's me. I'm here." I waved my arms frantically, but she didn't even flinch. She stood by the casket, clutching a tissue, her lips quivering as she whispered something I couldn't hear. I darted around the room, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Mom," I called, spotting her in the front row. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, her face buried in her hands. I dropped to my knees beside her, grabbing at her arm. "Mom, look at me. Please." Nothing. My hands passed through her like smoke. I stumbled back, the world spinning. I knocked over a chair in my panic, but it didn't make a sound. I screamed, clapping my hands together, stomping my feet. It was useless. The mourners moved around me, oblivious, like I was nothing but air. My reflection in the church's stained glass windows caught my eye. I froze. It was wrong. The Figure looking back at me wasn't a perfect mirror, it moved a fraction slower, its eyes slightly darker, as though it were watching me from the other side. The whispers in the room shifted. They didn't sound like mourning anymore. They sounded like voices low and distant, murmuring words I couldn't quite understand. My breath caught as the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and pulse, creeping closer with each flicker of the candles. I collapsed into a pew, my head in my hands. What was happening? Was I dead? A ghost? I didn't feel dead. I felt every heartbeat pounding in my chest, every ragged breath scraping my throat. But then, why couldn't they see me? I looked up at the casket. My casket. The flowers arranged on top, the soft hum of the organ in the background. It was surreal, beautiful in a macabre way. But seeing my mother kneeling, there broke something inside me. I should have called her more, she choked out to Sarah, who knelt beside her. I thought we had more time. I moved closer, my heart shattering. Mom, I'm here, I whispered, kneeling in front of her. You didn't fail me. You didn't. She didn't hear me. She didn't even flinch when I reached for her hand. Then Sarah spoke, her voice shaking. Do you think she knew how much we loved her? Something inside me cracked. I screamed, raw and desperate, but the sound didn't reach them. The whispers grew louder, curling around me like smoke. In the flicker of the candlelight, I saw my reflection again in the glossy surface of the casket this time. The figure smiled. It wasn't my smile. The flickering lights came first. At first I thought it was a trick of the candles, their soft glow, bending shadows across the walls. But then the overhead lights began to sputter, casting the room in quick, jarring flashes of dark and light. The air grew heavier, colder, as if the room itself were holding its breath. I backed away from the casket, my unease growing with each step. The whispers that had been faint murmurs earlier became more distinct, words I couldn't quite understand but could feel sharp and invasive, burrowing into my thoughts. Who's there? I demanded, my voice trembling. The shadows along the walls didn't stay still. They stretched, twisted, and began to ripple. Unnaturally, like liquid spilling in reverse. My reflection in the glossy casket lid flickered with each pulse of light. It didn't follow my movements anymore, it stood still, watching me. And then, slowly, it smiled. I stumbled backward, crashing into a row of chairs. The sound was deafening in the otherwise silent room, yet no one turned. My reflection in the casket tilted its head, and for a split second, I swore its eyes weren't mine. They were darker, hollow. I turned to the room full of mourners, desperate for help, but they seemed wrong. Their faces blurred, their movements slightly off, as if I were watching them through water. And then one by one, they began to turn toward me, their eyes unfocused yet piercing, their mouths whispering in unison. I clutched my head as the whispers swelled, each word drilling into my skull. My knees buckled as the room spun. Just before the darkness swallowed me, I heard one clear phrase rise above. The rest you were never supposed to leave. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the church anymore. I was outside, standing on the edge of a wooded clearing I didn't recognize. The air smelled damp, the ground beneath me soft with moss and fallen leaves. My head pounded as fragments of memories began to push through the haze. I remembered driving late at night, rain pounding on the windshield, the radio playing static, a sharp turn, headlights blinding me, and then nothing. The clearing felt familiar, but not in a comforting way. It was too quiet. Not a single bird chirped. Not a branch rustled. The world seemed frozen, holding its breath. Then I saw it a shape in the more distance. A car, half hidden among the trees, its front crumpled against a gnarled trunk. I stepped closer, my legs heavy as lead. The closer I got, the more the details came into focus. Shattered glass glinting like stars. A smear of something dark on the ground. A pair of keys. hanging from the open driver's door. My keys. My breath caught in my throat as the memories hit me like a wave. The screech of tires. The sickening crunch of metal. The cold rain soaking through my clothes as I lay on the ground, staring up at the trees. And the same voice from the funeral, soft and insistent. It's not your time. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I died, I whispered. I died. But then, why was I still here? And why did I feel like something was watching me? I was back in the church. I didn't remember walking there one moment I was in the clearing. And the next I was standing in the aisle, the whispers still circling me. My reflection in the casket was gone. In its place, the polished lid was smeared with faint handprints, as if someone or something had been trying to get out. Desperate for answers, I searched the room. The mourners were frozen now, their faces blank and featureless, like mannequins posed in mourning. I leaned in closer to Sarah, but when I touched her, her skin crumbled like ash beneath my fingers. A faint rustling drew my attention to the altar. A folded note lay on the floor, half hidden beneath the flowers. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The paper felt brittle, ancient, as if it had been waiting there for years. The message inside was scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting. You don't belong here. They're coming for you. The shadows along the walls began to stir again, moving toward me like a rising tide. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned to the casket. It was open now, but the body inside wasn't mine anymore. It was something else, twisted and wrong, with hollow eyes that stared straight at me. The whispers grew louder, pressing in from all sides. I clutched the note, my chest tightening as a single question burned in my mind. If I don't belong here, then where do I belong? The shadows moved differently now, no longer aimless but purposeful, converging at the edges of the room like a rising tide. My pulse quickened as I backed away, every instinct screaming that something was watching. The air grew colder, heavy with an unnatural silence, as if the church itself held its breath. Then I saw it. A figure stood near the casket, shrouded in the shadows. It was tall, its form barely human, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. Its face was a void, a black emptiness that swallowed the flickering light. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze. It wasn't just looking at me, it was through me, peeling back every layer of my being. The whispers grew louder, spilling into words I couldn't fully understand. But one phrase cut through, clear and cold: you don't belong. I stumbled back, colliding with a row of chairs, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it tilted its head, almost curiously, and began to move slow, deliberate steps that made the floor groan beneath it. As it approached, the mourners remained frozen, oblivious to the looming presence. Who are you? I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The figure stopped, the void where its face should be leaning close. The air around me vibrated. As it spoke, its voice a low, guttural rasp. You are neither here nor there. You linger where you should not, and they will come for you. Before I could react, the shadows surged forward, swallowing the figure whole. But it wasn't gone. I could feel it. It was inside the room, inside me. I turned back to the casket, now empty. My reflection appeared in its polished surface, but this time, it wasn't mine. It was the figure, staring back with empty, black eyes. The walls of the church rippled like water, the room warping as if it couldn't contain the weight of what was happening. The mourners flickered in and out of focus, their features twisting into unrecognizable shapes. My chest tightened as I realized I wasn't just being watched, I was being pulled. The whispers were deafening now, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Through the cacophony, the figure's voice returned, steady and commanding. You must choose. I turned, and there it was again, its shadow stretching impossibly long across the room. It raised one elongated arm and pointed at the casket. Move on, leave this place behind, or stay and face what comes. My mind reeled. Move on? To what? The thought of climbing into that casket, of surrendering to whatever waited beyond, filled me with a dread deeper than anything I'd ever felt. But staying meant something far worse. Those shadows, that presence, the thing I'd felt creeping closer with every passing moment. What happens if I stay? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head again, as if amused. You will belong to them. A cold wind swept through the room, and suddenly, I saw them, the shadows I'd been so afraid of. They weren't just shapes. They were faces, twisted and broken, reaching out with skeletal hands, their whispers begging and accusing all at once. They weren't just coming for me. They were waiting for me. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face. Could I really let go? Could I give up the life I knew, even if it meant escaping this nightmare? When I opened my eyes, the figure was closer, its hand outstretched. Decide. I reached forward and everything went black. When the darkness lifted, I wasn't where I expected to be. The cold ground beneath me was damp, the air heavy with the scent of earth and decay. I sat up slowly, my body aching with an unfamiliar heaviness. Around me, jagged headstones jutted out of the ground like broken teeth. The graveyard stretched on endlessly under a dull, gray sky that seemed too low, too close, as if the world was collapsing in on itself. I turned and my breath caught in my throat. My grave was right there, the dirt freshly dug, the headstone blank but for a faint, flickering reflection of my own face. The casket was open, and I forced myself to look inside. It was me, my own body, pale and still, dressed in the clothes I'd seen myself wearing in the church. My lips were slightly parted, as if mid-sigh, my hands folded neatly over my chest. The sight of it made bile rise in my throat. I stumbled backward, shaking my head. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. But the whispers returned, louder this time, their words pressing into my skull. You didn't choose. You belong to neither. The figure appeared again, its body coalescing from the shadows, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. This time there was no distance between us. It reached out, one elongated finger brushing against my chest. The sensation was ice cold, and suddenly I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground, my body frozen, trembling as though it was no longer my own. You linger, it rasped, its voice scraping against my mind like nails on glass. You are caught between, and so you remain. I wanted to scream, to beg, but my mouth wouldn't move. My reflection appeared in the polished casket lid, but it wasn't mine anymore. It was its face, dark, hollow eyes, and a smile that stretched too wide, too sharp, like it knew something I didn't. The reflection reached out, its hand pressing against the inside of the lid, as if it were trying to claw its way out. The figure stepped back, leaving me alone in the cold silence of the graveyard. The whispers faded, replaced by a new sound, the creak of dirt shifting, the faint groan of something moving beneath the earth. I looked down and saw the soil around my grave trembling, rising. A hand burst through, skeletal and gray, its fingers grasping blindly at the air. Then another. And another. My pulse thundered as I stepped back, tripping over roots that hadn't been there before. The hands pulled themselves free, revealing faces, shadows twisted into people, with empty eyes and gaping mouths. They stared at me, their movements jerky and wrong, like puppets with invisible strings. You took too long, they whispered in unison, their voices layered with something ancient and cold. And now you are ours. The shadows surged forward, and I tried to run, but the world spun. My legs buckled, the ground swallowed me whole, and the last thing I saw was their faces closing in, their mouths opening, impossibly wide. When I woke, I was back in the church. The casket was closed now, the mourners gone. The air was silent and heavy, the faint scent of lilies lingering. I stood, trembling, and turned toward our door. But as I reached for the handle, my reflection in the polished brass caught my eye. It wasn't mine. The face staring back at me was its smiling wide, its hollow eyes watching, waiting. My heart raced as I stumbled back, but the whispers followed me, curling out of the shadows. They were no longer faint. They were clear, sharp, and inescapable. You're next. If you dare, share this story. But beware, every time it's told, the shadows creep closer, waiting for their next host. When you look in the mirror tonight, will it be your own face staring back, or something else waiting to take your place?